Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, join me each episode as we discuss all things guitar. Well, hello there, my friends, and welcome back to yet another exciting episode of your favorite podcast, or one of your favorite podcasts, hopefully, Shad's Guitar Show. It's certainly my favorite podcast, but I suppose I have kind of a bit of a vested interest in enjoying my own show, right? And you know, as I've said a little bit in the past, I've watched the show grow, and it's been really rewarding. I feel like every time I do an episode, I learn something new. My good friend Chris was just mentioning that he learned a lot of new stuff about Steve Vai and the gem model and all that from the last episode, and I think that's really, really cool. So I'm glad that friends and listeners out there are gaining some knowledge about different things from listening to the show, and hopefully that includes you as well. And today we're going to get into a sound. And this is, if you've been around the guitar community for any length of time, you have inevitably heard the term the Brown sound. Now, if you're not a guitar player, that could almost be kind of weird, like the Brown sound, like it could almost sound not that pleasant, but we know that it's very pleasant, and we know that it is a term that was coined by Mr. Edward Van Halen, the late Edward Van Halen. Eddie was striving for the sound that he called the Brown sound. Now, most of us probably know that, and if you don't know that, you've probably heard the term the Brown sound, and maybe this is going to be, a total education in what that actually means. And for those of us who had kind of a cursory knowledge that, oh yeah, that was Eddie Van Halen's sound or whatever, we're going to find out a bit more about what it actually is, and if it's something we might want to try to go after ourselves and have as part of our own option when it comes to different tones for playing. So let's get into it and discuss the legendary Brown sound. All right, so today we're going deep into one of the most chaste, one of the most mythological, most argued about guitar tones in rock history, and that is Eddie Van Halen's Brown sound. Eddie described it as a tone that was warm. He used the word Brown sound, and the name stuck so hard that it became shorthand in guitar shops and gear forums for an entire philosophy of tone chasing. Today we're going to pull it apart, piece by piece, the amp, the guitar, the secret weapon that nobody really knows about, and the modifications that a backstreet tech in Hollywood made that changed rock guitar forever. Let's start with what the Brown sound actually is, because it's not one single thing, it's a combination of choices, several of them pretty unconventional, all stacked on top of each other. By the time Van Halen's debut album landed in February of 1978, guitarists across the country heard Eruption and Ain't Talking About Love and assumed Eddie was playing through some exotic boutique rig, or that the record had been studio tricked into sounding that huge. The truth was almost the opposite. The core of the Brown sound came from one guitar run into one amplifier with shockingly few effects in between. The complexity wasn't in the number of boxes on the floor. It was in how hard Eddie pushed a small handful of components past their intended limits. And that's really the whole story of Eddie Van Halen as a tinkerer. He wasn't satisfied with what gear was supposed to do. He wanted to know what could it be forced to do. And at the heart of the Brown sound sits a single amplifier, a 1968 Marshall Super Lead 100-watt plexi head, which Eddie reportedly picked up used in the early 70s. Now on paper, a plexi Marshall is already loud, and it's an aggressive amp built for stadium rock. But stock, even at full volume, it doesn't produce the kind of creamy saturated breakup that defines Eruption. Cranked all the way, a healthy 100-watt Marshall is still fairly clean by modern high-gain standards. Loud, absolutely, but not the singing compressed distortion Eddie was getting. So Eddie did something most players wouldn't have dared. He started messing with the amp's power supply itself. And this is the part of the story that gets repeated in every gear forum, every thread, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Eddie ran his Marshall through a variac, a variable auto transformer, essentially a dial that lets you control the voltage going into a piece of electrical equipment. So instead of feeding the amp a full, clean 120 volts, Eddie dialed the variac down, by most accounts somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 volts, though the exact number shifted depending on who told the story and which interview you're reading. And that starved the amp of voltage, which did something very specific. The power tubes started to break up and compress at a much lower overall volume and earlier in the signal path. The amp essentially thought it was working harder than it actually was, and the result was a thick, saturated distortion with a softer, rounder top end. None of the harsh fizz you'd get from simply cranking a Marshall at full voltage. It's a dangerous trick, frankly. Underpowering a tube amp changes the way current flows through the output transformer and can, over time, stress components that weren't designed to run that way. But Eddie didn't care. He wanted that sound, and he was willing to treat his amplifier like a science experiment to get it. There's an important nuance guitar nerds love to argue about. Lowering the voltage doesn't just make an amp distort more, it changes the character of the breakup. It's softer, spongier, more vocal. The sponginess, combined with everything else in the chain, is a huge part of why the Brown sound feels like it's breathing instead of just buzzing. Voltage starving alone doesn't explain the whole tone, though. The other half of the story belongs to a man who, for years, guitar fans barely knew by name. His name was Jose Arredondo, an amp technician working out of Los Angeles who became something of an underground legend among players in Eddie's circle. Arredondo modified Eddie's plexi internally, rebiasing it, adjusting gain staging inside the preamp, and reworking parts of the circuit to push more usable gain out of the amp before it fell apart into mush. These weren't bolt-on pedals or external boxes. They were hand-done modifications to the amplifier's actual circuitry, the kind of work that requires someone who understood tube amp design at a deep, almost intuitive level. Arredondo went on to modify amps for a long list of other prominent Los Angeles players through the 70s and 80s, but his work with Eddie is the one that entered legend, partly because Eddie was famously secretive about exactly what had been done to his amp. For years, Eddie would cover the chassis, change the story in interviews, or simply decline to explain, fueling a kind of tone mythology where players assume there must be some secret pedal or processor hidden in the chain. And that secrecy wasn't paranoia for its own sake. Eddie understood something a lot of players take years to figure out. His sound wasn't a product you could buy off the shelf. It was a relationship between a specific guitar, an amp, and a specific tech's modifications, and his own hands, of course. Hiding the amp wasn't about keeping a trade secret. It was about protecting the only version of that sound that existed. But of course, none of this works without the guitar, and the guitar is its own legend. The instrument fans came to call the Frankenstrat. Eddie built it himself in the mid-70s out of parts, starting with a basic Ash Stratocaster-style body and neck he bought unfinished from Wayne Charvel's shop for around $50 for the body and roughly $80 for the neck. Into that body, Eddie installed a single humbucking pickup in a bridge position, a Gibson PAF, and he had pulled that out of one of his other guitars. Wired it directly to a single volume knob with no tone control, no pickup selector switch to fuss with, and nothing else to get in the way. Simplicity was the point. Fewer components meant fewer places for the signal to lose clarity or gain noise, and it meant Eddie could focus entirely on dynamics with his hands rather than twisting knobs. The body itself became iconic for an entirely different reason: the paint job. Eddie taped off sections of the body in rough striping patterns and sprayed it first black and then red, then layered black tape stripes back over the section before a final coat, producing the now famous red, black, and white stripe design that's been copied, licensed, and reproduced by Eddie's own signature guitar line for decades since. He also added a Floyd Rose-style locking vibrato system, relatively early in its development, which let him dive bomb and flutter the bar aggressively without the guitar sliding out of tune mid-performance. A mechanical innovation that, paired with his right-hand tapping technique, became as central to his identity as the tone itself. Here's a detail that surprises most people when they really study the rig. For the bulk of the first album, the effects chain was nearly empty. No rack of modulation, no multi-effects unit, none of the gear sprawl you'd associate with 80s guitar heroes. Eddie did use an MXR Phase 90, and on some tracks an Echoplex tape delay for texture, but these were used sparingly, as color rather than the foundation of the tone. The famous solo flourishes, the pinch harmonics, the two-handed tapping, the dive bombs, those were entirely physical, generated by technique, not processing. Strip away the phaser and the Echoplex, and the Brown sound is still recognizably the Brown sound. It's that foundational, and that's part of why it's been so hard for other players to fully replicate. People assume there's a hidden effect doing the heavy lifting, when really the heavy lifting was happening at the amplifier and, of course, in Eddie's hands. Once Eruption hit, the Brown sound became the white whale of an entire generation of guitarists and gear builders. Boutique amp companies built entire product lines chasing variations of it. Players hunted down old Plexi Marshalls and Variacs of their own, often without fully understanding the internal modifications that made Eddie's particular amp work the way it did, and frequently without the benefit of Eddie's specific touch and attack, which mattered just as much as any piece of equipment. Eddie himself kept evolving past it. By the time Van Halen released their later albums, his rig had grown more complex, and he eventually partnered with Ernie Ball, Music Man, and later Fender EVH brands to design signature guitars and ultimately the EVH 5150 series amplifiers, which were designed in part to give players legitimate access to tones descending from the original sound, without requiring them to risk frying a vintage Marshall on a Variac in their garage. Those later signature amps are an evolution, not a replica. The original Brown sound was tied to one specific modified voltage-starved 1968 Plexi, and one home-built Stratocaster copy with a single pickup and a single knob, a combination that, by its very nature, can be approximated but absolutely never perfectly cloned. And what I like most about this story isn't really the Variac or the rebiased Plexi or even the Frankenstrat itself. It's that Eddie Van Halen, at 22 years old, looked at gear everybody else treated as fixed. An amplifier's voltage, a guitar's wiring, the rules about how many pickups or knobs a guitar is supposed to have, and just didn't accept any of it as fixed. The Brown sound isn't a recipe. It's an attitude about gear translated into a sound. And I guess in that way you could say that the Brown sound is really more Eddie's philosophy than it is an actual sound. But regardless of what you call it, there's no denying how great those early Van Halen albums sounded. Eddie's playing was on fire, and his tone was the stuff of legend. And 50 plus years later, we're still talking about it, and we're still trying to achieve it. And if you haven't experienced it or don't know really what that sound is, if you're a younger player who maybe hasn't spent a lot of time checking out Van Halen, listen to the first 2 or 3 Van Halen albums, and you'll gain an incredible appreciation for Eddie's tone, but even more so, Eddie as a player. I mean, he was just absolutely changing the rules of guitar playing as he was going so. And if you get the bug and decide you want to go down the Brown sound rabbit hole of trying to achieve that tone, there are all kinds of models and profiles of amplifiers, from actual legit old Plexis to newer creations by companies like Friedman, who are making, Plexi-style replicas, trying to get that Brown sound. So it's all over out there if you want a little bit of that tone in your Quad Cortex or your Kemper or your Fractal or whatever your device is. Or maybe you actually still use an amplifier and want to go buy a 100-watt head and 412 cabinet. There are plenty of amazing boutique amp options out there, but be warned, those things are really heavy. If you enjoyed this episode on the Brown sound, please make sure to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to this right now, and share the show with a guitar playing friend. The next time you're on YouTube, I would love it if you would go to Shad's Guitar Show and subscribe. And when you're on Instagram, please go and follow Shad's Guitar Show. There is lots of cool content at both of those places as well that you can check out. And always remember that the best guitar player is the one who's having the most fun.